Welcome to Nice and Blunt, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Adam Riancho. We are live on YouTube, and these are my top 32 wide receiver rankings for 2023. Just before we get into the video, if you are not already, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. And if you want all of my rankings, all positions, and I go pretty deep, like at least 200 players are ranked on my Patreon. You can head over to my Patreon in the link in the description. And for $4.20 a month, you will get all access to all of my rankings and all of my waiver wire selections. I do not post those publicly on YouTube during the season. So with that in order, let me tell you how we are going to go through this video. I could go through a lot of different stats, but I've actually compiled a score for every single player. I guess you're going to have to trust that my math is correct. I have double-checked it, triple-checked it. I am pretty certain that these numbers are accurate. But there is a blunt score that I've given every single player we're going to mention in this video. And if you're curious how I got this score, this is the formula. I've taken 5 key stats on a per-game basis, so injuries are kind of removed, and we're getting raw numbers for what to expect compared to everyone else from each of these players. So the most important stat I'm using are half PPR points per game. I mean, at the end of the day, we need the PPR points. We need to score real fantasy points in order to put up numbers. So yards are very nice, but because the half PPR points are most critical, that is weighted most heavily at 30 points in this formula. Next, I have touchdowns per game, and I understand this makes it a little bit fluky. This score is not meant to be perfect. It is going to be a little bit flawed, but especially at the wide receiver position, touchdowns are very important, kind of critical in order for a player to go over 10 half PPR points. A little less relevant in full PPR, but we are using half PPR scoring for this video. So I have that number 2 in the ranking system for this formula at 24 points. Then I'm giving 20 points to total yards per game. However, because yards are assigned 0.1 point in fantasy, I'm really multiplying that number times 2. So I'm multiplying all of those metrics by the point system, and together we will get a total of 100 points because I'm also giving 18 to receptions per game. Receptions give you that half extra point, so they're very critical. And last but not least, it is relevant, but you don't get any scoring points from this metric. Targets per game are also factored in to this equation at 8 points overall. So now we have a total of 100 points. We've divided this final score by 100, and now that I've broken it down for you, this chart explains how the players fared when it comes to this metric. So before I get into each player, what I'm going to do is tell you where they ranked last year, whether or not that score is legitimate based on how many games they played, if it reflects the entire season or just a small sample of the season. Maybe another player was out of the mix and that elevated them, or maybe they had a quarterback kind of change throughout the season, and that could also skew some of the stats. But before I get into it as well, I also just want to point out, whoa, that's not what I want to do. Here's what we want to do. Just notice the tier breaks. Like, there's some very elite players up top with these 10 to 9 point scores. Then we kind of plateau in another tier in the high 8 point decimal points, in the high 8s, excuse me. And then we kind of trickle down once we pass wide receiver 10 into the 7 point threshold, the 6 point threshold. However, what's most notable, what I really want to point out, is once you hit wide receiver 20 right here, it really plateaus. There is very, very little difference between these players as we trickle through the list. So if you can get these top 10 players, especially the top 5, you are really in business. You have a massive advantage. If you can get a top 10 to top 15 player, you also have a pretty solid advantage. But once you hit wide receiver 20, there's not that much of a difference between them and wide receiver 32, 35. So that's why I'm giving you 32 wide receivers in this video. So with that in mind, we are going to get going, and we are going to start off at the top with Cooper Kupp, who this metric is very impressive. I mean, compared to anyone else, nobody ranks higher than 10 points. However, he did get injured last year. He only played half of the season, and this number is only reflecting a 9-game sample size. It's possible that that comes back down to earth. It's also possible that if Matthew Stafford does get injured again, the number will decrease. Only one of those games was played without Stafford, but honestly, it's hard to imagine that number goes down massively. It's really just the age that's a factor with Cooper Kupp, and also the injury concerns coming off of a half a season missed is pretty legitimate. So he's definitely elite. You can make an argument that he should be number one, but if I had to make a guess, I'm probably going to assume he comes down just a little bit when it comes to the overall stats next season, as he is a year older. Number 2 on this list, probably who you expected at number 1, it's Justin Jefferson, who only scored 8 touchdowns last season. This metric is absolutely legit. It's 17 games, and if anything, it's going to repeat. There is some room for improvement. He has caught 20 more receptions year over year, and on the Rich Eisen show are to crack 2,000 yards, 150 receptions, and most likely more than 10 touchdowns. So there's a chance that this goes up. Justin Jefferson, very, very safe. He's been elite all 3 years in the NFL. But next on this list is Tyreek Hill, coming in at 9.36. And I don't know if there's a massive room for improvement with Tyreek Hill, but one thing I want to mention, this number reflects all 17 games. He actually put up 9.98, so he was even closer to Cooper Kupp at 10 points when Tua was his quarterback. He did take a little bit of a dip when Tua went down, and we all know Tua is a little bit risky when it comes to those concussions. That is something you need to factor in. If he does lose his quarterback, he does lose a little bit of value with Mike White if he were to be the quarterback next season. But Tyreek Hill, definitely at the top. Let's move on to number 4 on this list, Jamar Chase, who did miss 5 games last season. And before his injury, Jamar Chase's blunt score was 9.78. So also even higher, much closer to Justin Jefferson's score. Kind of all 4 of these players are in that elite tier. You really can't go wrong with any of them. If anything, I might assume that Jamar Chase in year 3, if he stays fully healthy, would probably go up on this metric, probably put up even better stats. But there is the slight concern that Joe Burrow could possibly miss time. He's dealing with that calf strain. And at the moment, we don't have a clear, definitive timeline on when he's going to return. Odds are he's back week 1, and it's probably irrelevant. But something to keep in mind, now we are kind of stepping down a little bit once we hit wide receiver 5, who was Davante Adams. On this, it was Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs was wide receiver 5 last year with 9.04. And this number is very much legitimate. It reflects a 16-game sample size, so hard to imagine it really decreases. They did bring in Dalton Kincaid, but Gabe Davis was a little bit underwhelming last year as the number 2, and there's really nobody else behind him that really scares you. While there is some odd news in Buffalo this offseason regarding Stefon Diggs and how happy he is with that team. I mean, he plays with Josh Allen. Are you really going to bet against him? I wouldn't. So I think he'll stay the same. I don't think he's going to fall out of the top 10. That is for sure. But next on this list is Davante Adams with a score of 8.69. And Adams is probably going to go down. If I had to guess if he's going to have better stats this year than last year, it's probably going to decrease. I mean, Hunter Renfrow was really injured last year with those concussions. Darren Waller missed a lot of time. And while they did move off of Waller, the rookie Michael Mayer, probably going to stay more healthy, could demand a little bit more targets. Jakobi Meyers has also played in the Josh McDaniels system, so maybe that's a few less targets for Adams. And then the quarterback situation is a little bit of a downgrade moving from Derek Carr to Jimmy Garoppolo. So I would assume that Davante Adams probably moves down just a little bit because of all those factors. But this metric is absolutely legit. It reflects all 17 games for Davante Adams. So far, very impressive players. These are all pretty typical names. I'm not sure you're surprised by any of these guys so far. But next on the list would be A.J. Brown. And this metric is slightly skewed just a little. Well, not really. It represents the 15 games that he played with Jalen Hurts. So this number is very much the case. However, it is worth mentioning. This metric did rise to 8.55 when Gardner Minshew was the quarterback. So that rushing viability under center does kind of limit the volume just a little bit. It could possibly be a little bit better if they threw the ball more than last year. So that's something to keep in mind, but it is a little bit touchdown dependent. 14 touchdowns is a little bit hard to repeat. But coming in at only 1 decimal point behind A.J. Brown is CeeDee Lamb, who I think could be even better this season. This metric represents 12 games with Dak Prescott. It did go down when Cooper Rush was the quarterback. So it's possible that with no Zeke Elliott, with a more pass-heavy scheme, CeeDee Lamb could be even better, could possibly move in to the top 5 if he overtakes not only A.J. Brown, but Davante Adams, and maybe even Stefon Diggs. There is a higher ceiling, I think, for CeeDee Lamb. But we're definitely still in the top 10 moving forward, and our next player is Amon-Ra St. Brown, who didn't score that many touchdowns last season. There were also a few injuries that kind of messed with his stats early on in the year. Like there was also a concussion that technically wasn't like a really legitimate concussion either. Like his early season stats last season, he was coming off the field a little bit more than you would expect. So this year with no TJ Hawkinson at all, it's pretty much secure that he's the clear number 1. I expect even more targets, more than 150 for Amon-Ra St. Brown this season. I would assume his stats might go up this year, given the circumstances. But next on this list is Garrett Wilson, also top 10. And this stat is a little bit of a cherry-picked sample size. It's not the full season because half of those games were with Zach Wilson. Not very impressive. This metric of 8.04 reflects the 8 games that he played with Mike White and Joe Flacco. So he was top 10 when the quarterback play was a little bit more consistent. And now he gets Aaron Rodgers. I feel like if anything, that stat's going to go up. He's going to be closer to Davante Adams than he was last season. So you can definitely trust Garrett Wilson as a top 10 receiver. That's what he was when his quarterback was not Zach Wilson. So now we are dropping below the 8-point threshold, definitely moving outside the top 10. But the next player might surprise you a little bit. It is Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers. And this is a little bit cherry-picked. These are the final 8 healthy games for Christian Watson. And I think that is definitely something to keep in mind. You don't really want to look too much into the early season stats for Christian Watson last year. He was a rookie. It took him some time to get going, to get fully acclimated, and he was injured at the beginning of the year. So it was a little bit tricky to trust, and his stats definitely are much lower when you look at the entire season, but they were truly elite. They were top 12 once he got going. He scored 9 touchdowns over the course of the season, and 8 of them occurred during those final 8 games. He had some really boom games last season with Aaron Rodgers. But now he gets Jordan Love. I would assume it falls back down to earth. There's also a lot more young receivers trying to establish themselves. Like last year, it was just Christian Watson and Allen Lazard. Daubs was injured a lot when Watson went off. So I'm not fully convinced he will be as good. I expect him to be a little bit worse than he was last season. But next on this list is Jaylen Waddle with a score of 7.75. And this is the number for all 17 games. But I also want to mention, as I mentioned with Tyreek Hill, this number did go up when Tua was the quarterback. When Tua was not the quarterback, he really took a hit. And the number it actually is with Tua is 8.27, which is identical to A.J. Brown. So there's really a lot of similarities between Jaylen Waddle and some of those elite top 10 receivers, I really think you can trust Jaylen Waddle. And if Tua can stay healthy, Waddle should probably be a top 10 receiver. One of the reasons why maybe Tyreek Hill is just a little bit tricky in terms of valuing him as the number 1 overall. He has a very legit number 2 right behind him. But next on the list is a player I'm not fully confident in repeating, and that's Keenan Allen, who is now 31 years old, playing in the Chargers offense. And while he's extremely consistent from a floor standpoint, he almost never scores more than 6 touchdowns, so that is a little bit unfortunate. And he only played 10 games last season, 2 of which he was injured in the first half, so that's something to keep in mind. He could come off the field. And then they also drafted Quentin Johnston. And if anything, they need Keenan Allen healthy for the playoffs. This team is trying to compete for the Super Bowl. So given his age, given the added competition in that offense, I would imagine he moves down this list a little bit more. Also, 8 of these games when he was healthy were pretty much all played with a injured Mike Williams, who was suffering with a high ankle sprain. So that's something to keep in mind as well. The Chargers stats last season, no one was like fully healthy the entire year. They're a little bit difficult to fully buy into. But next on this list is T. Higgins with a score of 7.2. And this number is actually a little bit generous for T. Higgins. It actually went down if you look at his entire season, but I'm only looking at the 14 games that he was fully healthy. If you remember, there were 2 games last season where he only played 5 snaps, didn't get a single target, and then came off the field with like a hamstring injury, and they just rested him to be safe. I am hoping that doesn't happen this year because he isn't a contract season. I think that is kind of like a slight blemish when you're evaluating him overall, and that's why I trust this number a little bit more. That's when he was fully healthy and finished the game. Those 2 other games bring his number to actually below 7 points on this score. So T. Higgins hopefully stays fully healthy, but should be fine as a top 15 receiver if that is the case. But next on this list is DeAndre Hopkins, and this number is actually really hard to fully trust. Not only is he going from Kyler Murray to Ryan Tannehill, that's definitely a downgrade. This number is actually much worse with Colt McCoy under center. When Kyler Murray went down, it was not as impressive. And a lot of these games were played without a healthy Marquise Brown. If you remember, Marquise Brown went down in week 7. That's when DeAndre Hopkins' suspension was lifted. And when Marquise Brown came back, he wasn't fully healthy. He was definitely diminished. And that's why I don't fully buy into the stats for DeAndre Hopkins. I expect them to go down next season, but this is definitely the ceiling. He could be top 15 if he can relive the glory days, but he is getting older. Also something to consider, also 31 years old, like Keenan Allen. But let's keep it moving. Next on this list is Chris Godwin, who is a target monster, definitely a player you can trust, but I don't know if I expect him to be as good this season. Going from Tom Brady to Baker Mayfield / Kyle Trask is really not something I trust, and I find it hard to believe that Chris Godwin will be as high on this list by the end of next season. But next on this list is a player I think gets really underrated. It's Tyler Lockett, coming in at a score of 6.83. And this number is absolutely legitimate. It's all 16 games that he played. He's barely ever missed time. He's been extremely durable. So maybe it's worth noting that Tyler Lockett comes in higher on this list than DK Metcalf. It's possible that you should trust him more so than DK. But with JSN coming into the mix, I have to imagine this number goes down. He's also now 9 years into the league. Getting older is definitely an area of concern. It's possible that he goes down with injury, but he's been extremely consistent. Tyler Lockett is definitely an underrated player, a guy that you should probably trust a decent amount. But next on this list is Amari Cooper, who I expect to go up with a full season of Deshaun Watson this season. And Watson, actually, when he played, diminished this score. So he was actually better with Jakobi Brissett last season. But Deshaun Watson did not get a full training camp, was very rusty when he came back. He's been looking pretty solid, according to reports this season in training camp, and I expect Amari Cooper to be a little bit better than he was last year. I trust Amari Cooper for sure in the top 20. That is for sure. But next on this list is a player that may surprise you a little bit. It is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Kirk was actually a top 15 receiver when it comes to half PPR points per game. So while, yes, Calvin Ridley is coming into the fold, I think Christian Kirk will be diminished a little bit. We will mention Zay Jones a little bit later. Actually, we'll bring him up right now. We can point out Zay Jones at this exact moment. Zay Jones is actually not that low, far behind him, just outside the top 30 with a score of 5.57. So at the very least, if Christian Kirk falls to the number 2 option in this offense, which is what we expect, he would still probably be a top 30 play. However, Christian Kirk is definitely not going to repeat this. He's definitely going to scale back those targets. He does get paid a lot, but Calvin Ridley will definitely be in the mix, definitely be the number 1 target for Trevor Lawrence. So that's something to keep in mind, but Christian Kirk's floor is definitely probably pretty safe. At the worst, it would probably be top 35, definitely usable. That is for sure. But next on this list is Mike Williams, definitely a boom-bust player. Actually, no, I skipped someone. Excuse me. Jerry Jeudy comes in at number 20 on this list, and with a score of 6.33, definitely pretty impressive. This is a full 15-game sample size. He did miss 2 games last season, but this number is legitimate, and I expect it to go up for Jeudy. I think he's going to be even better in the Sean Payton offense. We all know that Nathaniel Hackett had some big issues at head coach last season, and I would expect Jeudy to improve on these stats, and it's another season without Tim Patrick. The target share is very secure. He's definitely their number 1 option in Denver. But next on the list is Mike Williams coming in at 6.32. And we all know that this is kind of like hard to fully illustrate his ceiling. He can give you 25 points one week. He can give you 2 points the next week. He is very boom bust. And it seems like he always goes down with injury at some point. Like, that's the risk with Mike Williams. But if he was able to stay healthy, there's also top 10 upside with Mike Williams. But he comes in right around wide receiver 20. So, kind of the threshold that I was mentioning at the top of the video, kind of where it starts to peter out and really plateau. There's not a massive difference in value between him and some of these later players, but remember, he does have some of the highest upside in the game. He can always win you your week. He can also always lose you your week. You never totally know what to expect from Mike Williams. But next on the list is a player being drafted way higher on Underdog, and it's Devonta Smith. And this number is kind of concerning. Like, when you factor in, where he's being drafted, top 15, and where he's ranking here at number 22, maybe he's a little bit overvalued. He is the wide receiver 2 in this offense after all, but he is entering year 3, and his chemistry with Jalen Hurts was really starting to click at the end of the season, especially in the playoffs. He was lights out. So I am more confident that he will improve on these stats. One of the reasons why I think A.J. Brown might come down just a little bit. But it is also worth noting that when Gardner Minshew was the quarterback, DeVonta Smith was absolutely elite in that 2-game sample size. His score was actually 11.8, well above Cooper Kupp. So it's a very small sample size. It's hard to read into, but it's a little bit emblematic of his upside. And one of the reasons why I think he will be improving this year, I think they're going to use DeVonta Smith a little bit more than last season. And he got 130 plus targets last year. If that goes up, he could really, really produce elite numbers, especially if those touchdowns increase as well. So Devontae, a little bit lower on this list than you might expect, but still very solid. Let's move on to the next player who's also going well above this overall. It's Chris Olave, who was a rookie last season. So in year 2, you expect him to make a jump. There were some impressive stats, but it was really just the quarterback play that was really concerning. If you remove those first 3 games when Jarvis Landry and Michael Thomas were healthy and contributing, then Chris Olave's stats actually go up closer to about 7 points on this score. So I didn't include those. This is a full 15-game sample size for him, and it's a little bit lower than you might expect, but I am expecting it to go up. The upgrade at quarterback to Derek Carr is definitely going to help him, and now he's the clear number one entering camp. He should be lights out from the beginning. I do expect him to be top 15 this season. So I think he's going to go up, but now we hit DK Metcalf at 6.24, kind of a lot lower than you would expect given his ADP overall. Remember, Tyler Lockett is over here at 6.83. When it comes to this score, while it is a little bit flawed, Tyler Lockett was a lot more consistent. So that's one of the reasons why I don't fully trust DK Metcalf. Maybe he goes up, but remember, JSN is coming into the mix here, so that's a little bit concerning. And he ranks a lot lower on this list than you would have expected. Last season, he only scored 6 touchdowns, so that's a big reason why. Hopefully that goes up. That should increase, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's a little disappointing next season. One of the reasons why I'm a little bit low, a little bit off of DK Metcalf. But next on the list is Jahan Dotson, a player that you probably wouldn't expect to be this high. But Jahan Dotson missed a lot of time last year. He missed about 5 games. And in those 11 or 12 games that he played, he scored 7 touchdowns as a rookie dealing with injuries. So this sample size is a little bit cherry-picked. This is the 8-game sample size when he was fully healthy and seeing a minimum of 70% of the snaps. But he's on par with players like DK Metcalf and the next guy on this list, Deebo Samuel. Jahan Dotson is really, really good, really underrated, a player that I think you can trust. And that's where I'm also kind of concerned with Deebo Samuel. For him to rank this low on this list is not that impressive. He didn't score anywhere near as many touchdowns last season, and his role in the run game was very much diminished when Christian McCaffrey came to this team. So he also dealt with injuries. That was also a factor here. But it's really concerning when you consider his teammate, Brandin Aiyuk, is the next ranked player on this list at 6.18. So almost identical numbers for the two of them. Deebo did score more touchdowns, so that is relevant for this metric. But one thing to keep in mind, these numbers were their best for both of these players with Jimmy Garoppolo under center. They weren't impressive with Trey Lance, but that was only like 1 or 2 games. And with Brock Purdy, both players actually fell to below 6 points on this score. Deebo had a score of 5.06, so he was almost like wide receiver 40. He was not that impressive when it comes to this metric. And then Brandin Aiyuk was pretty much the same. He had a score of 5.95 in his 6 games with Brock Purdy. So receivers do kind of concern me just a little bit. And I think their ADPs are okay, but I think you might want to draft them a little closer to wide receiver 25 than wide receiver 15, wide receiver 20. But the two of them are really similar. I don't see that much of a difference between either of these two 49ers receivers. But let's keep it moving. Next player on this list is Terry McLaurin, who does rank lower than Jahan Dotson. Remember, Dotson came in at 6.22, but Terry's still fine. He has a very high floor, but he did just get injured. He should be fine, but I do think Jahan Dotson is actually a little bit more valuable than he is. So I think Terry is probably going to take a step back with Dotson in year 2, and he is closer to wide receiver 30, 35 than some people might think. But next on this list is DJ Moore, and DJ Moore is a little bit hard to like fully gauge because he had so many different quarterbacks last season. He had Baker for several games, then he had PJ Walker for a couple games, then he finished the season mainly with Sam Darnold under center. So this is kind of an average metric of all of those stats at 5.99. His average on the entire season was actually only 4.98, but his score with Sam Darnold was 6.53, and it was kind of all over the place depending on who the quarterback was. So I averaged it out to about 5.99. He comes in around wide receiver 30 overall, and I think that's kind of what to expect with Justin Fields. Maybe it goes up, but he had a career high in touchdowns last year at 7. Usually it's only 4. That's one area where I'm a little bit worried about DJ Moore. But next on the list was Marquise Brown, and he is also kind of hard to like fully gauge. He was incredible though in those first 6 games without DeAndre Hopkins. His score was actually 8.34, and that is higher than AJ Brown. That is top 10 for sure. So Marquise Brown could be that good, but we don't know how many games that Kyler Murray is going to miss. So somewhere around here, similar to DJ Moore, is I think where you should be valuing Marquise Brown. But yeah, it's a little bit difficult to totally gauge what to expect with Colt McCoy next season. At least we know DeAndre Hopkins is leaving. He should be better this season, should be more consistent from a volume standpoint. Next on this list is Drake London, who is also a little bit hard to gauge based on the stats of last year. And this is a 17-game average, but it's definitely skewed by the quarterback play. He actually only had 4.98 points with Marcus Mariota, and that number rose to 6.95 with Desmond Ridder. So he was actually much closer to like Amari Cooper and T. Higgins on this list if we only look at those last 4 games. But remember, those games were without Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts didn't play on the field at all. So also kind of a hard player to gauge, but I have him here right around 6 points on the blunt score. And I think somewhere around wide receiver 30 is about his floor. And I do think he will be better this season in year 2. He also entered the year coming off a leg injury, and he should be better, more healthy this season. So the stats with Desmond Ridder, very, very optimistic. Definitely a reason to rank him higher than this coming into this season. But next on the list was Mike Evans, and Mike Evans had a very disappointing season. And this is also a little bit cherry-picked. I removed that massive Week 17 game where Tom Brady was just trying to get him to cross that 1,000-yard threshold. With Baker Mayfield, I think that is a record that is in jeopardy. Mike Evans is usually very consistent, but you know the touchdowns are going down, and odds are the quarterback play is really going to be diminished to the point where his stats come down as well. So he is not a top 30 wide receiver in my opinion. I find it hard to trust Mike Evans. I think he will be even worse this season as he gets older. I think best case scenario is if he gets traded and goes to a better team with a better quarterback that's competing for the playoffs. But next on the list is Michael Pittman, who should probably be a little bit better. Pittman is also kind of hard to fully gauge. On a 16-game average, he actually came in at 6.23, so even higher, closer to like Jahan Dotson, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Aiyuk. However, the number really fell off a cliff without Matt Ryan. It was only 4.7 without Matt Ryan. So that's where it's a bit of a average here as well for Michael Pittman. But the coaching upgrade with Shane Steichen is definitely interesting, definitely optimistic. However, the rookie Anthony Richardson is more of a run-first guy, and we don't know what's going to happen with Jonathan Taylor. That is very much up in the air. Maybe Michael Pittman is actually worse, not better. I think he'll be somewhere close to around right here by the time next season is over. But next player on this list is not a player I expect to repeat this at all. It's Jakobi Meyers. But we haven't mentioned any New England Patriots so far, and Jakobi is no longer in New England. So this is probably where Juju Smith-Schuster is probably going to rank by the end of the season. And Juju put up similar stats last year as well. But what's interesting about Juju that's kind of hard to fully gauge, he was way, way better in Kansas City before his concussion. He actually had a score of 6.65, and that is inside the top 20. That's like Chris Godwin numbers. So when it comes to when he was healthy, the wide receiver 1 in Kansas City, that's what his role was. You can possibly expect top 20 numbers. It's just extremely difficult to know who that's going to be given all of the up in the air factors in Kansas City. So this is a number I think is probably a little safer to project for his year in New England. However, he was not the same player following his concussion, and that happened right in week 8. It was really like a tale of 2 seasons for Juju Smith-Schuster. But this number is legit. It's an amalgamation of all 16 games for him. Next on the list, though, is Gabe Davis, who is extremely boom or bust. He was dealing with a foot injury last year that he suffered early on, so maybe that's a reason to be more optimistic. I do think this number will go up, but Gabe Davis, especially if it's not best ball, very hard to trust in your lineup week to week. He is extremely touchdown dependent. That is for sure. But last few players I'm going to mention, kind of just going to rip through this. Brandin Cooks, he's no longer the wide receiver 1 like he was in Houston now, and I don't fully trust the Mike McCarthy offense, so I think he will come down a little bit next season. But next player is Treylon Burks, and this is also very much cherry-picked, this score of 5.15. is only the last 4 games that he was healthy with Ryan Tannehill. So that's kind of the low-end floor of what to expect with Hopkins, the wide receiver 1 in Tennessee. It's hard to fully trust the Tennessee offense. So yes, Hopkins comes in way, way higher on this list. He comes in over here at 7.09, but he could fall anywhere all the way down this score to where Burks was. He'll probably finish somewhere in the middle, somewhere around wide receiver 25, but Burks is really not that good when it comes to this metric. A little concerning for the Tennessee offense as a whole. But another player in the Kansas City offense that I want to mention is Mecole Hardman, who did leave Kansas City. So don't really look at this metric at all. I'm not mentioning this for the sake of Mecole Hardman in New York. But I'm bringing it up as another thing to keep in mind with Juju Smith-Schuster. So when it comes to what to expect as the wide receiver 2 in Kansas City, it's very much different from the wide receiver 1, but it is decent. Like, there's a lot of risk with those Kansas City receivers. If you can hit, though, remember I mentioned Juju was actually much, much higher. It was actually like over here when he was healthy. So there's a huge disparity between the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2, and we really don't know who that is in the Chiefs offense. If you want to take a shot on Sky Moore, you might only be getting a player like Mecole Hardman if he's not the number 1, if it's actually Kadarius Toney, or if it just filters through a bunch of players. There's as much upside as there is risk with the receivers in Kansas City. That's why I'm bringing up these 2 players right here. But last players to mention on this list, they're actually really underwhelming when it comes to these metrics. It's George Pickens at 4.93 and Deontay Johnson at 4.24. Deontay is actually wide receiver 50 when it comes to the blunt score. And these numbers are not emblematic of the entire season. They're actually cherry-picked to only give you the 11 games with Kenny Pickett. It was actually a lot less productive than you would think. But I also want to keep in mind my score is a little bit skewed. I really value touchdowns for the sake of this score, and I think that's why these 2 players are so low on this list. Deontay didn't score a single touchdown last season, so that's a big reason why he's low as fuck here. And then George Pickens only scored 4 touchdowns as well, and not all of them were scored with Kenny Pickett. So we really need the touchdowns to go up in order for these 2 players to be a lot more viable inside the top 30. I expect that to happen, but this is the risk that comes with those 2 Pittsburgh receivers. They could barely be top 40 receivers if the stats from those final 11 games last year with Pickett do repeat. So now that I am done with this, we will get over to the tiers. And because I've broken down a lot of receivers so far, I'm not going to go too in-depth on these players, but I'm going to break them down into tiers, and I will give you my top 32 rankings, as I mentioned at the top of this video. So number 1 is pretty much obvious. I think you'd be kind of a little bit crazy if you didn't rank Justin Jefferson at number 1. He is clearly the most elite wide receiver. He's definitely number 1 for me. But I'm going to have Ja'Marr Chase at number 2. If he stays fully healthy, if Joe Burrow doesn't miss any time, then Ja'Marr Chase is just as talented as Justin Jefferson, and he had 9 of those 12 games last season with at least 10 plus targets. Sometimes he was getting like 15, 16 targets. These 2 players are can't miss, and he also scored 9 touchdowns in those 12 games. I think you can really trust Ja'Marr from a touchdown standpoint. That ceiling is truly elite. But I also consider Tyreek Hill in the elite tier. I don't think it's really that big of a drop-off. I mean, you could honestly argue for Tyreek Hill at number 1 or number 2. It's not that big of a difference. You can also argue for Cooper Kupp at number 1 as well. As we mentioned in the blunt score, he actually had the highest score of any player, but he is the oldest of this bunch, and there is a little bit more injury risk, not only for him, but also his quarterback. That's also the reason why I have Tyreek Hill ranked behind Jefferson and Chase. Their quarterback could go down. That could lower their stats just a little bit. But now we enter the next tier where I'm very confident that these guys will finish inside the top 10. And at number 5, I do have Stefon Diggs. He plays with Josh Allen. He's been really, really solid, really consistent ever since he joined the Bills. And while he might not finish inside the top 3, I think 5 is probably the most likely scenario for him of anyone in this tier. He's just so good. There's no way he doesn't finish top 10. Like, yeah, there's some weird shit going on with him, but I still trust him. The target volume is going to be really, really high, and the offense is elite. But next on this list is where I start to deviate from the underdog rankings. This is where I have CeeDee Lamb coming in at number 6. And we did have CeeDee Lamb and A.J. Brown within a decimal point of each other, so it's really not that big of a deal. But I do think that the Dallas offense will be a little bit more pass heavy this season. They're going to lean on their number one receiver just a little bit more with no Ezekiel Elliott, especially in the red zone. And I think he's going to score some more touchdowns, whereas I think A.J. Brown might score a little bit fewer touchdowns, especially if DeVonta Smith takes a little bit of a leap in year 3. So you really can't go wrong with any of these players. I have them pretty much identically ranked, but I do have CeeDee Lamb just barely over A.J. Brown. Next on the list, I have Amon-Ra St. Brown, who I think is a player that could really, really help you start off 5-1 or 6-0. You want to start off red hot in your redraft league, and with Jamison Williams suspended, a rookie tight end in Sam Laporta replacing T.J. Hawkinson, and no real wide receiver 2. Like, the next guy would be Josh Reynolds, or possibly it's Jahmyr Gibbs. Amon-Ra St. Brown is absolutely going to light it up. He's probably going to see 10-plus targets this season and definitely put up elite numbers. Those touchdowns should go up. So that's why I have him ranked just above Davante Adams, who I find it a little bit difficult to believe will score 15 touchdowns yet again with Jimmy Garoppolo. So I'm still very confident that Adams is a top 10 play, but if I am going straight up between him and Amon-Ra St. Brown, I prefer Amon-Ra. I have Davante Adams at number 9. But at number 10 is Garrett Wilson, who we did see was a top 10 player in the blunt score metrics when he wasn't playing with Zach Wilson. With Aaron Rodgers under center, it's possible I am too low on Garrett Wilson. It's possible that he should be ranked above A.J. Brown. I think that's the highest I'd be willing to go, number 7 overall. But the lowest I'm willing to go on Garrett Wilson is number 10. So I think if you draft him here, you are drafting him at his floor. Now we enter the next tier, the top 5 upside wide receiver 2s. And as we mentioned with Jaylen Waddle, he could be just as valuable as CeeDee Lamb, just as valuable as A.J. Brown as well. That's what he was with Tua Tagovailoa under center. But Tua could always go down with another concussion. I think he will be a little bit worse with Mike White under center, and that's why I have him outside the top 10. But Waddle is extremely, extremely consistent. If anything were to ever happen to Tyreek Hill, though, you know that Waddle would vault into the top 5 himself, so you can really trust him. He has elite speed, elite yards after the catch capabilities. But next on this list might shock you a little bit, and this is where I have Calvin Ridley. And yes, I am projecting a little bit more, but let me take you back to the blunt score real quick. We mentioned where Christian Kirk was, and unfortunately, I don't have Calvin Ridley's thumbnail in this thing. That's the one thing I forgot to do prepping for this video. However, if this was the symbol for Calvin Ridley, just play a little bit of make-believe with me, and we look back at Ridley's last 2 seasons with the Atlanta Falcons, his last 20 games when healthy in 2020 and 2021, his blunt score is actually 8.13. It's actually just up here, and he would be identically ranked to Amon-Ra St. Brown. That's how good Calvin Ridley can be if he can put up the same stats he did the last 2 seasons he played for the Falcons. Yes, 15 of those 20 games were alongside Julio Jones, but it's still truly, truly elite, and that is why I have Calvin Ridley ranked at number 12. It wouldn't shock me if he finishes top 5. It also wouldn't shock me if he finishes number 20, because we just haven't seen him in the NFL for a while. But when you look at his tape from camp, he looks really, really good. He looks like he's hungry, like he has a big chip on his shoulder. And I think with Trevor Lawrence, an elite quarterback, he is going to prove that he is still amazing. So that's why I have Ridley at number 12. I really want him in my redraft format. I'm a real believer in the Jacksonville Jaguars this season. But next on the list at number 13 is Chris Olave. We are projecting a bit of a leap for him as well, but in year 2, as the clear number 1 with a better quarterback in Derek Carr, I think it'll happen. I think he will be a top 15 wide receiver this season. It's possible that upside is actually top 5. It's unlikely, but it is possible. That's for sure. Next on the list is T. Higgins. I do think he's also top 15. I have him at number 14 in the rankings. And if anything were to ever happen with Jamar Chase, we've actually seen that he doesn't actually vault into that elite tier. But even if that doesn't happen, even when Jamar Chase is healthy, sometimes he puts up like 30-point games. Sometimes he really goes off. And he's also in a contract season. He is guaranteed to put up 1,000+ yards like he has the last 2 years. And I really, really trust T. Higgins, at least as a top 15 play. He has that elite upside any given week. But you know who else has that elite upside? DeVonta Smith. He's my wide receiver 15, who should take another leap in year 3. If anything were to happen to A.J. Brown as well, if he were to miss time, DeVonta Smith could be top 5 as well. There is some really, really high ceilings for all of these players, but it is a little bit injury dependent and a little bit of a projection that we just haven't totally seen just yet to rank them top 10. That's why I have them between 11 and 15. But next we enter the following tier of the boom bust wide receiver 2s, and at number 16 is where I have Amari Cooper, who should be better. He should be better than last year than he was with Jakobi Brissett and with Deshaun Watson, very, very rusty. So I expect him to be at least top 20. I'm very confident in him. However, if you look at his stats, if he didn't get in the end zone, he had some bad games where he wasn't even a top 35 play, and he was like either getting you 20 points or like barely 6 or 7 points last season. So he is a little bit boom bust. That is for sure with Amari Cooper. But next on the list is Jerry Jeudy, who I am projecting a little bit of a leap this season with Sean Payton under center. Maybe he could turn into Michael Thomas. He could really be that good. But his stats last season with Russell Wilson, once he really got going, were still pretty legit. He was top 20, and I have him ranked here at number 17. So that's not that bad. That's definitely pretty decent. But next on the list, I have Mike Williams, who we saw just behind Jerry Jeudy on the blunt score. And I do prefer Mike Williams over Keenan Allen. That's just my personal bias. I want the ceiling. I want that double-digit touchdown upside. I'm not really worried about Quentin Johnston. If anything, I'm a little more worried about Josh Palmer elevating and Keenan just staying healthy. But Mike Williams, I think, is the true number 1 receiver for the Chargers. And he's my boy. I'm going to stay on brand, and I'm going to rank him higher than Keenan. I prefer him for those reasons. But blunt score. So maybe I'm a little bit too low on Christian Watson at number 19 overall in these rankings. However, I just don't believe in Jordan Love. I do think he takes a step back. Maybe not from a volume standpoint, but from a touchdown standpoint, I just don't think that elite ceiling will be there for Christian Watson. So this is where I rank him. But next in this tier is DK Metcalf, who can put up 25 points any given week, but he only scored 6 touchdowns last season. If that repeats, he's going to have more bust games than boom games. And the addition of Jackson Smith and Jigba does concern me. Although JSN just had surgery for his wrist, it's possible that he misses a little bit of time this season, and that could help DK Metcalf maintain that elite ceiling. I do have him at number 20, so I'm still trusting him a decent amount as the number 1 in Seattle, but I do have him ranked lower than he is ranked on Underdog. Next at number 21, I have Keenan Allen, who I'm a little bit worried goes down with injury, but if he doesn't, I might look foolish ranking him below Keenan Allen, but he's 31. There is some risk with Keenan, and Josh Palmer has his same skill set. I think he will allow him to come off the field a little bit, and Keenan almost never scores more than 6 touchdowns a season. He's really volume driven and more of a full PPR option. These rankings are for half PPR. If it was full PPR, I would have him and Mike Williams switched. That would be my preference, but it's not, and this is where I rank him at number 21. But number 22 is Deebo Samuel. 2 seasons ago, he was a top 5 wide receiver. Last year, he wasn't even top 30 because he missed a lot of time, and he was very boom or bust. So you're kind of just hoping for the best with him. But his stats with Brock Purdy were not too exciting. He really fell off a cliff in terms of touchdown production last season. That is my main concern with Deebo Samuel. But he is a wide receiver 2 and a wide receiver 22 overall. I still trust him a decent amount. Next tier is the best flex plays that you can find. And these guys are very interesting. I might be a little bit too low on them, but there is a little bit of risk involved, especially if they're in a new environment or have a new quarterback similar to Drake London. It's not exactly a fully new quarterback, but we've never seen him play with Desmond Ridder and Kyle Pitts, and Bijan Robinson adds another component to this rushing offense. I'm a little bit worried that Drake London isn't top 20, but I am very confident that he is at least top 30. I have him at number 23 for those reasons. I think he's a pretty safe top 25 guy in this year in 2023. But next would be DJ Moore, who looks really good in camp in the preseason. His connection with Justin Fields looks very solid. They pay him a ton. They traded for him. So there is some upside here, but on average, he only scores 4 touchdowns per season. However, last year he scored 7, but on top of that, he fell below 900 total yards last season from scrimmage, where normally his average was 1,200. So there is some top 15 upside for DJ Moore. There's also some barely top 30 possibilities as well. I think he's a little bit risky, more of a flex play, and at wide receiver 24, he's fine. He's not bad. I think his ADP is fair, and I don't want to reach on him, but I am really excited if he falls to me at all. If you can get him in the late 4th, early 5th round on Underdog, very, very happy to take DJ Moore. But next on the list is Brandin Aiyuk, who we showed earlier is almost identical to Deebo Samuel in the metrics that we were looking at. And at wide receiver 25, I trust him a lot. I almost want to rank him over Deebo straight up. He seems a little bit safer to stay healthy in a vacuum. But George Kittle staying there is definitely Purdy's favorite option in the red zone. The touchdown viability, a little bit tricky in San Francisco to fully predict, but he's really safe, really consistent. Aiyuk is one of my favorite players to draft in round 5, but I have him ranked just above DeAndre Hopkins, who is playing for the Tennessee Titans this year, not the Cardinals. I just didn't get a thumbnail for that. It wasn't available on ESPN yet, and he's okay, but I don't think he's going to be amazing. I really worry about that Tennessee offense. They're not going to score a ton of points, and with Derrick Henry, they are a run-first scheme after all, so Hopkins worries me just a little bit. Burks just got hurt, though, but he's probably going to be ready for week 1. It's not really going to help him overall in terms of his fantasy points. But next I have Christian Kirk, and I might be a little bit too high on Christian Kirk, but here at number 27, I think that's his floor. That's where he's being drafted on Underdog, so very fair value. If I'm wrong at all about Calvin Ridley, then Christian Kirk could be back inside the top 20. He was really good last season. He's paid a ton, $18 million per season. He had 135 targets last year. That probably comes down, but even Zay Jones was being ranked inside the top 20 last season to close it off, and Trevor Lawrence has really hit his stride, definitely going to keep things viable, and Christian Kirk is probably going to get easier coverage with so much attention going to Calvin Ridley this season. That's why I trust him. That's why he's one of my favorite flex plays. I love his ADP in the 5th round. Very, very safe pick, in my opinion. But now we enter the last tier of this video, and they are good flex plays. There's going to be some games where they're really viable, but there's just something missing about these players, whether it be the quarterback situation that I just don't trust, or too many wide receivers in their offense to really feel confident that they're the clear number 2 or the clear number 1. But at least this guy is the clear number 1, that's for sure. It's Marquise Brown of the Arizona Cardinals. He was looking like a possible top 10 play without DeAndre Hopkins last season before he went down, but that was with Kyler Murray. With Colt McCoy, David Blau, Clayton Tune perhaps under center, I have no idea what to expect, and it's possible they hold out Kyler Murray the entire season because this team is probably going to tank for Caleb Williams. So I'm a little bit worried about the touchdown production here, but the volume should be very safe. He's definitely a flex play. I have him top 30 at number 28. He's decent, but there's just something missing with Marquise Brown. There's also something missing with Chris Godwin, and I mean, we know what it is. It's Tom Brady. Tom Brady's not in this offense anymore. It's Baker Mayfield, possibly Kyle Trask, and that is very concerning. There is a scenario where they trade away Mike Evans, but I think there's also a possibility that they trade for Trey Lance as the quarterback, and if that's the case, it's really going to be very hit or miss. I find it very hard to invest in any Tampa Bay Buccaneer that isn't Rachaad White, because you just know there's just so much volume. It's just so tricky to really believe in them. The ceiling is pretty low in Tampa. But the next player is Tyler Lockett, who maybe I'm underestimating again. As I showed earlier, he was even more consistent, higher ranked than DK Metcalf. But with JSN coming into the mix, Tyler Lockett another year older, it's just hard to trust him. I have him here at number 30 for those reasons. I might be too low on him, but you're also betting that Geno Smith can spread it around efficiently enough to keep him viable. I'm expecting him to come down a little bit in terms of production, but with JSN dealing with that wrist injury, that's why I have him ranked here. I would have preferred JSN if you asked me a week ago, but it is what it is. JSN at the moment is dealing with a wrist injury and is going through surgery today. But Jahan Dotson is the next player on this list at wide receiver 31, and he needs to score a lot of touchdowns in order to pay off. But Terry just got hurt a little bit. Terry's probably going to be fine, but I do prefer Jahan Dotson straight up over Terry McLaurin, who is now in year 5. Jahan Dotson's going to be in year 2, going to be fully healthy, and they drafted him in the first round for a reason. Jahan Dotson is really good, especially in the red zone. So I like him the most in terms of the Washington Commanders receivers, and at wide receiver 31, I think his ADP is fine, pretty fair. I don't think Terry is worth drafting, though. And at number 32, I am making a little bit of a projection, but I think George Pickens will see just as many targets as Deontay Johnson this season, and I also think his touchdown numbers are going to be a lot closer to 10 than they were last season. Last year, he only scored 4, so I do think he's going to take that leap in year 2. I think George Pickens is going to be better, and that's why I have him ranked at number 32 in my wide receiver ranking. So there you have it. Those are my top 32. And we got Jefferson, Chase, Tyreek Hill, Cooper, Kupp in the elite tier. Then we go Diggs, CeeDee Lamb, AJ Brown, Amon-Ra, Adams, and Garrett Wilson in the confidently top 10 tier. Then in the top 5 upside wide receiver 2s, we have Waddle, Ridley, Olave, T. Higgins, and DeVonta Smith. In the boom bust wide receiver 2 tier, we have Amari Cooper, Jerry Jeudy, Mike Williams, Christian Watson, DK Metcalf, Keenan Allen, and Deebo Samuel. In the best flex plays tier, we have Drake London, DJ Moore, Brandin Aiyuk, DeAndre Hopkins, and Christian Kirk. And then in the just missing something flex plays, we have Marquise Brown, Chris Godwin, Tyler Lockett, Jahan Dotson, and George Pickens. So those are my top 32 wide receivers. Now that I am done with this list, let's check the poll. It looks like Marquise Brown is our leader so far, and no one has voted for Tyler Lockett, but there is a tie with Brandin Aiyuk and Drake London. Both of them have received 2 votes, but Marquise Brown is the leader with 3 votes in this poll. So very interesting. I kind of agree with you. Marquise Brown has that truly elite upside. It's just the quarterback situation that's hard to trust. But I will end that poll. Looks like Rock Out sent a message. Would you trade Justin Jefferson for Lamb and Najee Harris? I'm weak at running back, pretty strong at wide receiver. I don't think I would. I'd rather hold on to Justin Jefferson, that elite number 1 overall guy, and try and trade another wide receiver for someone straight up similar to Najee Harris. I think that'd be a better use of your trade capital. Najee Harris worries me a lot now that Jaylen Warren's starting to look really good, and that's just how I feel. But Sebastian, I have the 101, so obviously I'm going Jetta. But for the 2-3 turn, what should I look for? I'm in a 12-man full PPR league, 2 wide receivers, 1 flex. I would definitely consider an elite quarterback like Jalen Hurts or Josh Allen, maybe Patrick Mahomes. That definitely gives you an advantage. It's hard to get them a similar type of player coming back around, but in a full PPR format, I think it's worth taking a running back that has some pass catching ability. Maybe if, let's see, I'm trying to think of my rankings real quick. I think if Pollard is available to you, I would try and get Pollard. Odds are you're probably not going to get him, but it is possible. If not, I would probably target Calvin Ridley and an elite quarterback, and then try and piece it together with a lot of depth at running back. Because unless you're getting like Jacobs or Taylor Derrick Henry, odds are you're really not going to see like similar value coming back around in the next tier. So depending on how comfortable you are, either go with an elite quarterback if available, like Jalen Hurts or Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, or just go with an elite running back inside the top 10 and another really solid, really volume-driven wide receiver. That's what I would do. And looks like we've reached an hour on this live stream. It's been fun. Hope you've enjoyed this video. And hopefully it's a little bit more graphic-driven than the last one. And I will see you next time. But as a reminder, if you would like all of my rankings, you can find those on Patreon at the link in the description, patreon.com/niceandblunt. For $4.20 per month, you will get all of my rankings preseason, as well as all of my waiver wire selections during the season as well. But if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and I will see you in the next video. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.